Quincy Jones has never been afraid to speak his truth, but what he said at 83 years old about Diana Ross didn't just peel back a layer of Motown, he cracked the whole foundation wide open. Because when a man who's shaped the very sound of American music says he never trusted one of its most glamorous icons, it forces everyone to rethink the glittering facade Motown tried so hard to sell. At first glance, it might seem petty or personal, but what Quincy revealed, it wasn't gossip. It was survival, it was business, it was betrayal, and it was deeply rooted in something that had been brewing since the 1960s, when the dreams of black musicians were being bought, sold, and manipulated by the very machine that claimed to be protecting them. From the outside, Quincy and Diana looked like royalty in the same court. She was the poised diva with the perfect voice, the darling of Berry Gordy's empire. He was the genius arranger, producer, composer, already shaping legends before Ross even became a star. But behind the scenes, there was tension, mistrust, and unspoken moves being made by people who understood that in Motown, power wasn't just about who had talent, it was about who had control. And Diana Ross, she wanted it all. She wasn't just chasing fame, she was grabbing power. But that came at a cost, and Quincy saw it coming long before anyone else did. Back in 1968, Quincy Jones was riding high on a string of career-defining successes, with his work in jazz, film scores, and groundbreaking pop crossovers. He had just finished working on the score for In the Heat of the Night and was preparing to launch into one of the most prolific decades of his life. Meanwhile, Diana Ross was in the middle of a transition, stepping out of the Supremes and into a solo career. But what most people didn't realize at the time was that Berry Gordy was orchestrating this move with surgical precision. Gordy wasn't just launching Diana, he was crafting her into something bigger than music. He wanted her to be a brand, a movie star, a legend, and he was willing to bulldoze anything and anyone in the way, including her former bandmates, including industry norms, and according to Quincy, even the truth. Quincy had a front row seat to the games Motown played. He saw the way young artists were handled, controlled. He saw contracts that buried musicians in lifetime obligations. He saw the way Gordy would lift some up only to push others down. And when it came to Diana, he saw something different. Not just ambition, but strategy. Ruthless strategy. In Quincy's own words, she knew how to play the room. And that wasn't a compliment, because in the world Quincy moved in, real musicianship mattered. Loyalty mattered. What Diana represented to him wasn't just a pop star. It was a shift in the industry, a move away from art and toward manipulation. Then came 1972, and everything started to crystallize. Diana Ross starred in Lady Sings the Blues, a film produced by Berry Gordy that fictionalized the life of Billie Holiday. Diana gave a powerful performance, but to purists like Quincy Jones, who had known Billie personally and deeply respected her artistry, the portrayal felt hollow, polished, sanitized. It wasn't about Billie's truth, it was about Diana's image. That was the moment Quincy said he knew for certain. He could never trust Diana Ross, not because she wasn't talented, but because she was willing to rewrite history to fit a narrative, and the industry cheered. The film was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, but to Quincy, it was a betrayal of everything the jazz community stood for, everything Billie had lived through. He never said it out loud at the time, but the wound ran deep. What most fans never knew is that behind closed doors, Quincy had been approached about working with Diana several times. He turned them all down, not because he didn't see her value, but because he didn't want to be part of the machine that propped her up at the expense of others. Quincy had already been burned by the industry more than once. He watched black artists get erased, cheated, manipulated, and Diana, in his eyes, wasn't fighting that system. She was benefiting from it. And perhaps most damning of all, he believed she knew exactly what she was doing. In one of his later interviews, long after Diana's star had dimmed slightly and the glitz of Motown had faded into nostalgia, Quincy reflected on those years with a tone that mixed wisdom, exhaustion, and cold truth. He said, "There's a difference between being great and being famous. Diana was famous." That one line sent ripples through the music world. Because coming from Quincy Jones, a man who had worked with Michael Jackson, Ray Charles, Frank Sinatra, legends who bled for their craft, it wasn't just shade, it was a damnation. But it wasn't just about personality clashes or creative differences. There was a deeper distrust, one tied to how Diana Ross handled relationships, particularly with the men around her. Her relationship with Berry Gordy was no secret. They had a daughter together, and while some saw it as a love story, others, like Quincy, saw it as leverage, a calculated move that helped her ascend even faster through the Motown ranks. Whether it was fair or not, the perception stuck. And for Quincy, who came from a world where everything had to be earned twice as hard because of the color of your skin, that kind of shortcut was unforgivable. Then in the 1980s, when Quincy was producing Thriller with Michael Jackson, Diana once again hovered at the edges of the story. She and Michael had a complicated bond, part mentorship, part emotional entanglement. But Quincy, ever the observer, didn't like the energy. He reportedly warned Michael about becoming too entangled with Diana's orbit. He didn't elaborate publicly. But those who knew him say Quincy felt Diana was more interested in proximity to greatness than greatness itself, that she aligned herself with power, and once she had it, she used it to shape the narrative in her favor. Quincy had seen it all before, with Billie Holiday's biopic, with the Supremes' breakup, with the way Motown morphed into a Diana Ross platform, and he wanted no part of it. Even as Diana tried to shift her legacy, rebranding as a mother, a trailblazer, a survivor, Quincy remained distant. At awards shows, they'd pose for pictures, but the warmth was never there, and as Quincy aged, his filters dropped. He began speaking more candidly, dropping bombs in interviews about everything from the mob's involvement in the music industry to secret affairs between stars. And when the topic of Diana Ross came up, he didn't hold back. He didn't call her names. He didn't rant, he just stated flatly that he never trusted her. And for Quincy, that said more than any tabloid headline ever could. Because Quincy Jones was a man who had sat in rooms with presidents. He had survived racism, poverty, near-death experiences. He had orchestrated the soundtrack of a generation. When someone like that says they never trusted you, it lands different. It cuts through the noise, and it forces people to ask, what did he see that the rest of us missed? Then in 1993, the American Music Awards hosted a tribute segment to Motown's legacy, reuniting many of the label's biggest stars under one glittering roof. Diana Ross was front and center, as always, draped in designer and framed in spotlights. She gave the kind of polished performance fans expected, controlled, graceful, iconic. But Quincy Jones, watching from the audience, didn't clap with the same enthusiasm. According to people seated near him that night, his eyes never softened. He watched her like a man reading an old script one he'd read 100 times before. Because for Quincy, Diana Ross's performance wasn't just a celebration of Motown. It was a reinvention of it, a rebranding. A moment where the messy, painful truths of the past were glossed over in sequins and scripted memories. And that, in Quincy's world, was the biggest betrayal of all. Behind the scenes, Motown had left scars. The label was once a beacon for black artistry, but over time, the business turned cold. Diana Ross had risen to become its crown jewel, but many others, Martha Reeves, Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, were cast aside. Quincy knew all of them. He knew what they'd given up, what they'd lost. And in every glittering Diana Ross comeback, he saw a whitewashed version of history that erased the blood and grit behind the music. Quincy wasn't bitter, he was protective of the real story, of the pain that built the Motown empire. And Diana, to him, symbolized the industry's willingness to forget. In 2001, Quincy sat down for a long-form interview where the conversation drifted toward legacy, his, Diana's, Motown's. He paused, then said something that rang like a quiet gunshot. Truth and talent don't always share the same spotlight. It was a loaded statement. Those who understood Quincy's past, the battles he'd fought to be taken seriously as a black composer in a white-dominated Hollywood, knew exactly what he meant. He wasn't just talking about Diana Ross. He was talking about an entire generation of performers who had learned to survive by adapting, by smiling through exploitation, by aligning with the right people, by rewriting stories that weren't theirs to rewrite. The issue wasn't that Diana wasn't talented. She was. Quincy never denied her gifts. The problem was that in his eyes, she weaponized her image. She became more myth than musician. And once that happened, Quincy couldn't trust her, because the myth was built on omissions, on other people's sacrifices, on decisions made in quiet rooms where power wasn't earned, it was exchanged. There was one incident, never widely reported but whispered in industry circles, where Quincy had to decline a high-profile collaboration because Diana was set to be involved. The project, a televised tribute to black female icons in music, had Quincy tapped as a possible executive producer. When he found out Diana would be the anchor of the special, he backed out. Quietly, respectfully, but firmly. One source close to the production said he told the organizers, "I don't rewrite history." That one sentence killed the deal, and it spoke volumes. As the years went on and both Quincy and Diana aged into living legend status, their paths continued to cross at industry events. They were always cordial, always camera-ready, but insiders say there was never warmth, never nostalgia, just two titans playing roles, one protecting legacy through image, the other through truth. In a sense, they had become opposites in the same ecosystem. Diana was the curated star, polished to perfection. Quincy was the unfiltered elder, dropping hard truths like jazz riffs, improvised, cutting, real. In 2018, Quincy Jones gave the now infamous interview with Vulture where he detonated bombshell after bombshell, claiming he knew who killed JFK, exposing the secret affairs of celebrities, and dragging the music industry's dirtiest secrets into the light. He was 84 years old and clearly done playing nice. When the interviewer asked about Motown, Quincy didn't hold back. He praised Smokey Robinson's writing. He respected Marvin Gaye's bravery. He admired Stevie Wonder's genius. But when Diana Ross was brought up, Quincy went silent. Just a moment, long enough for the interviewer to feel the shift. Then Quincy gave a wry smile and said, "She always knew what side of the camera to stand on." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. And that was the brilliance of Quincy Jones. He never had to shout. He just told the truth. And the truth, when it comes from someone who's seen the worst of the business and survived, hits harder than any insult. He had watched Diana rise. He had seen her align with Berry Gordy, leverage every opportunity, and master the art of staying relevant. But he'd also seen what was lost in that process: friends, integrity, authenticity. Quincy never trusted Diana because he knew what ambition unmoored from responsibility looked like. He'd seen it destroy artists, and he had no interest in being part of that machinery. Then came 2021, when Quincy received a Lifetime Achievement honor at the Grammy Awards. It was a monumental moment, celebrating a man whose fingerprints were all over the last 7 decades of American music. Diana Ross was in attendance, seated near the front. She clapped, she smiled, she even rose for the standing ovation. But when the camera panned to Quincy's face, he barely acknowledged her. He thanked Ray Charles, he honored Michael, he saluted Sarah Vaughan and Count Basie. But Diana's name, not mentioned, not even once. And in that silence, Quincy made his loudest statement yet. What makes Quincy's confession so haunting is that it wasn't built on scandal. There were no tabloid-worthy feuds, no public takedowns, just quiet, measured rejection. He didn't need to destroy Diana Ross's reputation. He just told his truth. And for someone like Quincy, that was enough, because trust, once lost, is rarely recovered. And for Quincy Jones, whose entire career was built on navigating the most dangerous and manipulative corners of the entertainment world, trust was everything. Diana may have charmed presidents. She may have headlined the Super Bowl. She may have inspired generations. But in Quincy's eyes, none of it changed the fact that she chose self-preservation over collective truth, that she stood on the shoulders of others without acknowledging the weight, that she sanitized pain for applause, and that was something he could never respect. Then in 2023, a private industry gala was held in Los Angeles, an exclusive room filled with executives, living legends, and new age stars paying homage to the old guard. Quincy, now 90, was escorted in with quiet reverence, a living monument of a man who had been part of every musical epoch from bebop to hip-hop. Diana Ross was there too, radiant as ever, still carrying herself like the headliner she always believed she was born to be. They shared the same space, but not the same energy. As tributes were read and old songs were performed, some of the newer artists, many of whom only knew Diana Ross as a legend and Quincy Jones as a name in liner notes, watched with wide eyes. But those who knew the stories, the ones not printed in magazines, felt the chill. Because even after all these decades, the wall between Quincy and Diana was still intact, and it had never once been breached. That same night, a young reporter from a digital music outlet managed to get a brief word with Quincy. They asked what he thought about the legacy of Motown now that so many of its key players were aging out or gone. Quincy, never one to dodge, said something that dropped like a bomb in an otherwise pleasant evening. Motown was built on brilliance and buried under ego. He didn't name names. He didn't have to, because everyone in that room knew exactly who he meant. Diana's smile reportedly faltered for a brief second, just enough to show the mask slipping. But she didn't respond. She never did. That was her power. Silence disguised as grace. Quincy's statement lingered, because ego was the unspoken currency of the Motown era. The machine thrived on ambition, on image, on pushing artists to the breaking point and rewarding those who played the game best. And no one played it better than Diana Ross. She outlasted everyone, not just because of talent, but because of relentless image control. Meanwhile, those who didn't play along, the Mary Wilsons, the Florence Ballards, even Marvin Gaye, either got pushed out or pushed down. And Quincy saw it all. He never forgot it. What most people don't understand is that Quincy wasn't just an artist. He was a historian. His memory was a vault, and he guarded it fiercely. He had watched music legends die broke, die forgotten, die bitter. And he had made a promise to himself early in his career that he would not be part of the machine that destroyed his own people. That's why trust was sacred to him. That's why someone like Diana, who had danced so freely within that machinery, could never be in his inner circle. Not because she didn't suffer, Diana had her battles, but because she never used her power to shield anyone else. She used it to climb, and once she got to the top, she never looked back. There's a story that's rarely told, one that happened in the early 90s during a private fundraiser in Beverly Hills. Quincy was being honored for his humanitarian work, and Diana Ross was scheduled to perform. At the last minute, Quincy pulled out of the event. His reps cited scheduling conflicts, but those close to him say it was something else entirely. He had learned that several artists who had been burned by Motown were quietly blacklisted from the event's guest list to make space for more press-friendly attendees. Quincy was furious. He reportedly told the organizers, "Don't honor me while you erase the people who built this." That's the kind of man he was, principled, ruthless about fairness, and utterly unwilling to stand beside anyone he believed had contributed to that erasure, even if that person wore sequins and had a voice like velvet. As Quincy entered his 80s and then 90s, the industry began finally giving him his full flowers. Documentaries, tributes, award shows. And through it all, Diana Ross's name remained a noticeable absence in his public acknowledgments. When asked why, Quincy didn't launch into exposés. He simply leaned on one word again and again: trust. He didn't trust the stories she told. He didn't trust the moves she made. And most of all, he didn't trust the narrative she left behind, one that often cast her as the hero of a story built on the backs of others. In the end, Quincy Jones's refusal to trust Diana Ross wasn't just about her. It was about everything she represented: the polished machine, the glamorous myth, the sanitized legacy. Quincy had survived too much, seen too much to pretend otherwise. He had worked with truth-tellers, with broken geniuses who poured their blood into every note, with revolutionaries who used music as a weapon, not just a ticket to fame. In that world, Diana was a performer, but Quincy, he was a builder. A believer, a warrior. So when Quincy says he never trusted Diana Ross, it's not some casual celebrity gossip. It's a code being cracked, a truth being spoken in an industry built on silence. And that truth isn't about Diana alone. It's about how the business rewards those who play the game and punishes those who don't. It's about how image became currency, how legacy became performance, and how, even after all the glitter fades, some people still remember what really happened backstage. Because Quincy Jones never needed to tear Diana Ross down. All he had to do was stand still and tell the truth. And when a man like Quincy speaks, the silence that follows says more than any chart position ever could.